Thank you for my theme music.
You chose that, huh?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I love the driving.
I think it suits you very well.
Yes, it's exactly me.
David, I want to start by asking you about something particular that happened at the IOP a couple of years ago.
Yes.
I think you'll probably remember this. The openly gay writer columnist Dan Savage, who's also the architect of the It Gets Better campaign, he came.
He did.
Before he came, LGBTQ students protested that he was coming in a minor way because of some of the language that he had used on his podcast. And when he was there, he used the word tranny in a conversation, mostly to talk about its historical context and evolution, and there was fury afterwards. On that same week, Rick Santorum appeared without a peep from those students. How do you explain that, and what would you say to those students who caused such a ruckus?
Well, first of all, I should point out that what Dan Savage was talking about was reclaiming words that were used in negative ways as positive ways. He pointed to the word queer and how the evolution of that word, and it was in that context that he used the word tranny. There was a student there who was offended by that, left, and this became an issue among the students. Rick Santorum did not use any of that language and did not, propagate any controversy while he was there, so it was a different kind of thing. I remember very clearly this. I was out of town when this happened, and I got back, and there was a petition signed by 1,000 students saying the Institute of Politics was propagating hate speech. And there was some nervousness among the staff. And, we met with students, and I explained to them that we're not going to censor conversation here. We talked about the context in which he offered that. Sorry that there was offense taken, but that we would be less than our mission if we were to begin to censor words and interactions between speakers and students.
When I hear a story like that, and I know I speak for other people too, I almost feel like all hope is lost. He was,
wow.
He was there. I'm melodramatic. I'm
yes,
a columnist.
okay.
They pay me to be melodramatic. No, but in all seriousness, there was no question whose side Dan Savage was on, and there was no question that, in the eyes of those students, he should have been or was on the side of the angels. If he can't speak without generating that sort of backlash, who can?
No, I understand that, but I also, what I said to my staff is what I'll say to you, which is these kids are bright, they're centered in many ways, but they're young people, and I always said, try and remember what you were like when you were 19 and you were 20, and part of the role that we have to play as educators is to provide some sense of perspective. And I think the most dangerous thing that can happen is, especially in the moment in which we're living historically, if we allow those kinds of passions to govern who we invite to campus and the kinds of interactions that occur. And the most important thing that we can do, and I certainly believe that as the director of this institute, is provide the opportunity for students to have give and take. Even if you're inviting a speaker with whom people deeply disagree, I never view it as honoring that speaker by inviting them. I view it as giving students an opportunity to question closely those views with which they disagree. You know that because we had this discussion, Van Jones was there. Am I leaping ahead on yours?
Yeah.
I
No,
was
you're
peeking over your shoulder.
Oh, that's not fair, David. Well, let me bring up Van Jones. So this is about a year and a couple months ago.
Yes.
I love this quote so much. I've used it in a column. I've used it in speeches.
It's brilliant.
And I want to read it for the audience, for anyone who hasn't heard it, but also because I want to then get your reaction to something. Van Jones was talking at the IOP, and the subject of safe spaces and kind of rigorously patrolled conversations came up, and he said this to the students: "I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. I want you to be offended every single day on this campus. I want you to be deeply aggrieved and upset, and then learn how to speak back. because that is what we need from you. David, when it comes to political debate, are too many schools coddling their students and treating them with kid gloves?
Well, look, I think there's enormous pressure because, you know, we do live in this tribal time in our politics. There's deep polarization. And let's be honest, if you look at the vote in the last election, you know, Hillary Clinton won overwhelmingly among people with postgraduate degrees. Whites split, college-educated whites, and she lost by 40 points among non-college-educated whites. Young people voted overwhelmingly for her over Trump. And so campuses generally have a skew. And in this deeply polarized environment, there is a lot of pressure. One of the professors at the University of Chicago invited Steve Bannon recently for a debate with Austin Goolsbee, the former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, on globalism. And what could be richer than that? And the campus was in an uproar, and a lot of students and 100 faculty members signed a petition saying we shouldn't allow Steve Bannon on campus. The invitation was not rescinded. He himself decided, unfortunately, in my view, not to come. But I don't think we can yield to that. And I think, you know, there may be some campuses that react differently than ours. That we have a very strong commitment to free expression.
You just made reference to something you and I have talked about before, and I think that probably concerns everybody in this room, which is how polarized, how partisan our country has become. What are colleges doing wrong? What are they not doing that they could be to push back against that? Or are they doing things that might actually exacerbate it?
Well, I think to the extent that one censors visitors, and I think there are limits to anything. There is a reasonableness. I mean, there are speakers who offer no caloric value, right? And I think you need to recognize who they are. But for example, Van spoke a week after Corey Lewandowski came to the campus. Bob Costa from the Washington Post was a fellow at my institute. He invited Corey, with our cooperation, to talk about the 2016 campaign. It was right after the election. He had a lot of insight into the 2016 campaign. This created a big uproar, 150 students protesting, which is also part of democracy, by the way. But those inside the room, I think, had a very good exchange and learned a lot from it. We should not allow the passions of the moment to shut those kinds of exchanges down. And so I think more of that, bringing more diversity of opinion to campuses, and making that strong case to students that this empowers you, not the speaker. It empowers you. When you have a chance to stand and ask questions of you. We had Sean Spicer a few weeks before the inauguration, and this also engendered some protests. And one of the students asked him in an open session, what would you do if you were asked to lie? And he
Just
said,
a hypothetical.
And he said, it's crazy what these kids think of. And he said, well, I would have to quit. And that bit of tape was replayed, I would guess, tens of thousands of times. And it happened because there was this exchange on this campus between a student and Spicer. So my strong, strong feeling is let's have a diversity of opinion and experience, and let's have at it. I'm from the Van Jones School. He said, we want you to be strong, not safe, and this is the gym. The campus is the gym, because the world is going to demand that you be strong.
So let's say a student comes to you tomorrow and says, you won't believe the get that I manage, but a week from now, we can have Roseanne Barr on campus. Do you welcome her? And if you do, is there a way you prepare for stage, conduct that conversation that insulates you from any badness, any bad blowback?
Well, I think we ban Ambien from the campus.
That's a good one, yeah.
Is one of the things
I'm on Ambien right now.
That would be a very challenging situation because there is a caloric there is a caloric question, and because beyond, and no, I'm not trying to belittle her in unfair ways, but you know, she has a long history of making comments like this that are offensive and incendiary, and that aren't really the advancement of an idea. They're just purely the advancement of a prejudice. So I'd be reluctant to invite her. She'd be a great Times talk.
Maybe you could just say no tweet. No, thank you. Yeah. If either of us does it, we'll just say no tweeting for 48 hours beforehand or after. That would probably be.
While we leave the country.
Yeah. Okay, so Trump's election surprised you.
Oh yeah.
Fair to say, surprised me. Surprised most people.
Shouldn't have, but it did. Yeah.
Okay. What should colleges be asking themselves if they bear any responsibility for it? And does the fact of it compel colleges to take a harder look at the way they're doing certain things?
Well, I do think that we as a society generally are very siloed. And so, it was striking to me. I have a home in rural Michigan, and I live in Chicago and work on the campus. And the people on campus and the people around where I live were astonished that Donald Trump could get elected president. And the people around where I live in rural Michigan all had Trump signs on their yards and couldn't see it happening any other way. So what is it? What is this disconnect? We're trying at my institute, this year we initiated a program that really flowed from my concerns about that, called Bridging the Divide. And we sent 10 students to Central Illinois, to Eureka College, where Ronald Reagan attended, a small rural college, and brought 10 students from there up. And the 20 of them went on these journeys together, talking to people about what was going on in the communities. And we did focus groups with voters in each place. And it was a remarkable thing to see these students become acclimated to the thought processes going on in these other communities and the challenges that existed. For example, a Eureka student, we were in this focus group in Peoria, and one of the voters talked about, our tax dollars getting sucked down by people who don't want to work. Well, they had been up in Chicago, and they talked to people in jobs programs and young people in the inner city who were looking for work. And this young man sort of volunteered after it. He said, I thought that was weird because we were just there and people want to work. They can't get jobs. That young man wouldn't have said that. And by the same token, things that were said in the Chicago group that just were so derisive of everyone in downstate Illinois offended some of the Chicago students because they'd spent time down there, they'd spent time with these other students. I think we have to do more things to try and break down these silos and try and reach a higher understanding about the lives that we lead. We live in these silos, virtual reality silos, and it's easy to dehumanize people. I think when you get to know them, you may not agree with them, but you have a deeper understanding of what motivates them.
So what can a college do practically in service of that? I mean, are we talking about curriculum and, say, general education requirements? Are we talking about the speakers invited? What's a sort of menu of things a college could explore to collapse that divide and not have people looking across it and just seeing devils on the other side?
Well, when I came to the university, one of the things I was very sensitive to was that I was not setting up an academic institute. And that's one of the ways in which I coexist with the academics. So I'm sure there are things, there's study to be done of what is going on in this country that could illuminate people, our students, about different movements, what's going on beyond the silo and so on. My role, and I think I would love to see this replicated on campuses across the country, is to bring speakers, a diverse group of speakers, to model civil discourse. In the last few weeks, we had Chris Christie at the IOP. We had Sally Yates, and we had Cory Booker, and I mean, we've had a broad array of speakers, and oftentimes I'll interview them or someone else will, but the conversations sound a lot different than what you hear on cable television in those little boxes when people are fighting. And I think we have to restore the notion that we can have these conversations and not dehumanize each other and not go to our corners immediately and try and seek out some truth from each other. So seeing that is important for these young people.
But you had Chris Christie and Sally Yates separately, right?
Yes.
How often, if ever, would you put two people on the opposite side of the divide together? Like, why not do an event with Dan Savage and Rick Santorum on the stage together? We
could, and we have done some things like that.
But not to shout at each other.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, I hope that people feel like I function in a little bit of that role. I mean, everybody understands that Christy and I came from different tribes. And so, and we try and do that with others as well. But I think we can and we should do more of that. What you don't want, though, is to turn it into a Roman Colosseum type of deal where, people are performing and playing the role that they think they're expected to play. That, I think, sets us back. And we've been careful to navigate around that. But we have visiting fellows who come for 10 weeks. Oftentimes we have people, it was interesting, we had Jason Kander, who had just run for the Senate in Missouri, and we had Jeff Rowe, who had been instrumental in the campaign against him, a very tough Republican consultant, both fellows at the same time. It was interesting to see them spending time together and having these conversations that they never in a million years would have had before. So that's another function of the Institute of Politics, and that isn't lost on these students.
I should pull back for a second. What is the central goal of the IOP, and what are you finding most difficult about achieving it?
Well, the central goal is, in my view, to create pathways for engagement for all these young people. I think this is the most public-spirited group of young people that I've seen since the 60s. But they are skeptical about whether elective politics is the way to solve problems. I mean, you go to them and they'll say, well, let's create an app, let's engage in social media. Powerful stuff, but Congress is still going to meet. Legislatures are still going to meet. We're still going to elect presidents. They're going to have an enormous impact on the equities that these young people care about. So our goal is to get them engaged, and not all in electoral politics. We don't have a journalism program, some in journalism and at NGOs. Many go into the foreign service and related areas and so on. But the measure of our success, and I said it when I started this 5 years ago, will be how many of them go in some form or fashion into the public sphere, into the public square. And we just did a survey of our alumni, and it was just an astonishing number of them actually have done that. Now, it's a self-selecting group, but a large group. We only have about less than 6,000 college students, and 600 students. Some of them are graduate students, but 600 students are deeply involved in the IOP. 2,000 participate each year. So that's how I measure success. I'll tell you one of the barriers that I found that is interesting. I borrowed this Institute of Politics name from the one at Harvard. I'm on the board there. Been there for 50 years. It's the sort of the gold standard. And I realized at some point that the two things that students are most suspicious of are institutions and politics. Major branding problem.
Two, yeah.
Major branding problem. And actually, what it does is it may limit the kinds of students who come through the door. And I've had a particular concern about having more minority students come through the door. So I would like to do better at that, at outreach, at getting a more diverse sweep of the campus involved in the IOP.
When you meet students who are already hard and fast in what they believe, sharp-edged partisans, et cetera. Where at that early stage of life do you find it's coming from?
Well, I mean, part of it is how they get information. As I talked earlier about these virtual reality silos, I mean, we can curate our news sources in such a way that our views are always affirmed, not always informed, and everyone inside the silo is kosher and everyone outside is alien. And that's a real danger. Interestingly, Frank, we also have these civic engagement programs, and we encourage sort of entrepreneurism. And one of the ideas that a group of students came up with is to create a web site called Flipside, which would curate. If you're on the left, for example, it would curate a news feed that includes some representative and responsible commentary on the right, and vice versa. So they're thinking. They're thinking about this. They understand that this is a big challenge. But look, I mean, Donald Trump has created he's a symptom of an environment, but he's also exacerbated an environment in which you're forced to choose and go to your corners. And they feel it. They feel like there's this struggle going on. And the hard thing is for conservative students on campuses, because generally they're in a minority. And one of the things that we try and do is, I just met with the young Republicans yesterday, is to make sure that we're providing opportunities and programming for them as well, and that everybody's talking to each other, so we can serve to create a better environment.
I mean, by the time they get to college, it's already kind of late in the game. But do schools need to start thinking about some sort of instruction or some mechanism by which students are taught to curate their information in a different way, to expand their feeds, in which I'm surprised at how often when you bring it up to many students, they're not fully conscious of how monochromatic their information universe is, how single ingredient their diet is. Is there something educators can do at the college level in that regard?
The question, I guess, is how.
Yeah.
Because the one thing that I think that the students are going to resist is a sense of trying to not just curate, but censor sources of information. So I mean, I think it would be a service, because they're bombarded with choices, and it's hard to arrive at that right place, which is why those kids thought about that idea. But how you do it, I think, is difficult. I want to mention one other thing that. One other idea that flowed from the Institute of Politics and these civic engagement programs was two young women decided that it was a problem that people go to voting booths and don't know who they're voting for or what's on the ballot. And so they created something called Ballot Ready, where you can type in your address and see the ballot that you're going to face when you go to vote, with information, nonpartisan information about all of the races and all of the issues. And they started that there. They did some pilot projects. They got some funding for it. And they're going to be operating in all 50 states in November. So, I always say these can be very depressing times. And yet I go home optimistic every day, which is a great part of my job, because of these kids. Because, as I said, they are skeptical, but they're not cynical, and they are trying to find a way forward.
That's those kids, right? But we've sort of been talking about partisanship and all that. We've kind of gone past step one, which is, as we know from the 2016 election, and it was not an outlier, the voting percentage of people in that age group is very, very low.
Yeah.
What do schools, what do colleges do about that?
Well, first of all, I think that it's low because there was this sense that that politics was basically a rigged game, and that essentially you had two parties that were motivated primarily by sustaining themselves in power, who often engaged in bargains that had more to do with the interests who fund them than, I don't know where they get this stuff. So I think that created, a lack of interest in voting. The one thing Donald Trump, I think, has done is you very rarely run into people anymore saying, I don't think elections matter. And so what, Harvard just did a poll, the Harvard IOP did a poll of young people. They do this on a regular basis. And they are projecting a much higher rate of participation in the fall. And this is, I think, a direct result of the 2016 election. I know what we're going to be involved in, and several of the IOPs will around the country, is a very, very rigorous effort to make sure that every student on the campus is registered and that everyone has all the information they need to make sure that they cast a vote, whoever they cast a vote for. So this is a real thrust, and I think this should be an ongoing effort. I mean, these kids have the greatest stake in what happens in these elections, and they should have the greatest interest in participating in them.
You served a president whom, regardless of one's political views, I think we probably all agree, approached the job with great dignity, great seriousness, grace.
I will not ask for any rebuttal time.
I was trying to provoke you. Yeah.
Yes.
What I'm curious about is you obviously know his biography very well, including his college years.
Yeah.
What about his college years explain the man he became, and what can we all take away from that in terms of sculpting a college experience for students today?
Well, I'll tell you one interesting story. I had the enormous honor of traveling to Buchenwald with President Obama and Elie Wiesel. On the way there, Obama said to Elie Wiesel, "You don't know this, but you changed my life." And he said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You came to Occidental College when I was a student, and you spoke, and it was part of my awakening, because I thought it was time to put my childish things away, that there were really important things to be involved in this world." And he transferred to Columbia, and he became very intensely interested in how he could make a difference. And from there, he went into community organizing on the south side of Chicago. So I'm not saying that that was the entire part, but it does speak to the fact that if you bring people who have experience beyond the academy to speak, that it can have galvanizing impacts on students. I think his experience in New York at Columbia helped shape him and certainly made him more sensitive and aware of some of the community issues that he would ultimately be dealing with in Chicago, or issues like it, or at least thinking about it. But we shouldn't omit his law school experience. I know we're talking about college, but and partly it's because he was a community organizer used to mediating, but he became the president of the Harvard Law Review and had to mediate all the time between contending forces, liberal and conservative. And I think that honed who he was in many ways. So the whole of his academic experience, I think, was very formative in terms of the person who he became as a public figure.
We talked about the Van Jones appearance before. Is there another or a few other conversations, events that you have been a part of at the IOP that went off in a way that you were particularly satisfied with? And what did you learn about the staging of those sorts of things, or the right kind of person to invite, or any of those dynamics that can make the moment as special as possible? Well,
I mean, I will say, we've had over 1,000 speakers, and in the last 5 years, and you always go to the ones that were most recent. I was really actually shocked at Governor Christie's appearance, just because I expected that, he's been a pretty strong supporter of the president. He endorsed him after he dropped out of the presidential race. Knowing how some of the students feel about Trump, I thought that he would get a much more contentious crowd. And they asked some challenging questions, but he was very open. And I know it went so well that he told no one to shut up and called no one a jerk. And it was, But I mean, I had students.
He's a humbled man.
I had, that may be it. I had students, can you imagine losing that recognition when he realized, my God, I'm not going to be the rudest guy in the race. He thought that he'd be the toughest, roughest.
His whole brand was demolished.
Yes. But he was unbelievably charismatic, and he was very, very, I think, forthright in answering questions. And what was heartening to me was, you know, there were Republicans there, but there were students on the left there who said that was a really good event. That was a really, and it speaks to the progress that we've made, because people expect those kinds of exchanges at the IOP. So.
It almost makes me want to say is the way to get students less cynical about politics to have them meet more politicians, but that doesn't seem quite like a great strategy either, right?
Well, not all politicians. I mean, if politicians come, these students can sniff phoniness and political language from 1,000 yards. So if politicians come and behave in that way, they will get challenged, and they will not do well. But if they feel, if the young people feel like they're having a genuine interaction, then they will be, they'll be thrilled with it. And that's true, you know, we've had people from, you know, Newt Gingrich and, you know, Paul Ryan came, which was an interesting session. It was a smaller group, 40 kids, and they asked challenging questions. And at the end of it, the student leader at that time said, you know, Mr. Ryan, I'm from Wisconsin, and I am not on your team, but I really appreciate you being here and answering our questions. And so, you know, those are the times that you know, I feel like we're doing a good thing. And I think everybody who passes through that program comes away with a sense that politics doesn't have to be as inane and as nasty as you know, what they're accustomed to seeing on TV. Not that they watch TV anymore, but.
I'm going to ask you one more really short answer question, and then we will go to questions that either pop up here, or if that's not working, we'll have people stand up.
The short answer thing was meant for me.
No. It's to let them know I'm getting to them in short order. Who's someone you've invited, would love to have come, have leaned on it, hasn't worked? Do you have a chance to publicly shame that person right now? Who'd you like to have that you haven't been able to get?
I will think about that as we answer these other questions.
Okay.
I want to see who I want to reserve that. I want to see who I want to reserve that honor for.
But you're also a diplomat.
Yeah, I'm trying.
All right. Do we have some questions to bring up here, control room? We don't. I guess we do. Okay. From Chris Davey at Ohio State. The Ohio State University and the newspaper company Gatehouse Media will soon go in the field for the first in what will be an annual national survey measuring how college-aged Americans consume news and how they perceive the media. What is a question you would include in this survey?
Well, I would include some form of, do you seek out news sources that are consistent with your views? Because I think that is part of the problem. You know, I think that you know, interestingly, I had an exchange on a podcast with my old colleague John Favreau, who's now doing the Pod Saves America thing, and I said, "Do you consider what you do journalism?" And he said, "No." He said, "We're engaged in activism. We're trying to get people involved." But I suspect a lot of people view it differently. A lot of the young people who listen to Pod Save America view it as a news source.
Are we losing the line between activism and journalism?
I think that that's definitely a danger. Again, my concern is that we can surround ourselves and only receive information that affirms our points of view. And we see it on the right, and we see it on the left. And that is very, very threatening.
So do students know the difference between a partisan piece of writing online that's meant to affirm them or sway them a certain way, and a piece of classical journalism?
Well, I think that's what you want, some of this research needs to determine. I think that, look, the kids I work with are very bright. I think they're discerning, but there is a powerful impetus to seek out those news sources, particularly when they feel like there's this struggle going on.
This is an anonymously asked question. In some circles, there is a discourse of cynicism pertaining to the role and present-day value of historically black colleges and universities. Being that HBCUs play an overwhelming role in creating the black middle class, produce the majority of black physicians, judges, and doctorates, and amass black intellectual capital, what would be your response to this cynicism? Well,
I think the answer to your question is contained within it, which is that the history of these institutions is very rich and important. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, I'm in the midst of reading Ron Chernow's wonderful new Grant biography, and I'm reliving the Reconstruction history through it, and the opportunity that was lost because the Reconstruction went in reverse, but that burst of education and learning, you know, among African Americans in the South right after the war, and what it meant. If we are going to be the country that we say we are, then institutions, including the historically black universities, colleges, are going to be an important part of that. So, you know, I don't know where I understand the cynicism, I suppose, but I think there's a rich history with which to push back on it.
This will probably be the last question, because then I have one closing one for you. And it is fittingly not asked anonymously. This is from Lee Maxey of MindMax. When discourse is reduced to 140 to 280 characters, often with masked anonymity, how does one explore complex issues that take time to address?
You know, it's a problem, and I'm an abuser of Twitter, so with a little more decorum than some on Twitter, but I'm on there a lot. And you can't communicate complex ideas on Twitter, and I do worry about our collective attention span. One of the reasons I do the podcast that I do is they're hour-long conversations, and it gives you a chance to air some of these things out. But you know, it worries me, especially as I look at these young people, how much of they're just spooling up, you know, Twitter, and that is what, you know. Now it does. They'll sometimes open up pieces to which the tweet refers. Yeah. But I worry about our collective attention span as a country and our ability to, you know, that's why I like actually to pick up a newspaper and read it and turn the pages and not jump around. And
we like it when you pick up a newspaper.
No, I understand that. But I must tell you, and you know, that I have to explain to some of the young people I work with what a newspaper is.
Right. Last question, I promise. You talked about the country that we want to be. In terms of your values, how hard is it going to be to recover from this presidency?
Well, first of all, it depends in part on whether it's a 4-year or an 8-year presidency.
How are you feeling about that? Sub-question to the last question.
Look, I don't think Donald Trump represents a majority of the country. Now, we know, and we saw in 2016, that you can represent less than a majority of the country and still get elected president. But I also think that he was the beneficiary of a confluence of events that made an unlikely thing happen. So, I mean, I think the odds are, there are plenty of people who would argue against this, but I think the odds are against him winning a second term, should he run for a second term. But look, I think I'm a believer in democracy, so I'm accustomed to the notion that when one party wins and the other party loses, that party gets to make policy. I have deep concerns about some of these policy choices that he's making and why he's making them. But that is the system. What is not the system is when the President of the United States, who is a trustee of our democracy, delivers hammer blow after hammer blow to the rule of law, to fundamental democratic institutions, I think that does long-term damage, and I worry about that. And that makes the mission, our mission at the Institute of Politics, all of our missions as educators, I think all the more important, because democracy, we have to keep reminding ourselves that democracy is not a gift. You know, Robert Kennedy said the future is not a gift, it's an achievement. Well, democracy is not a gift, it's an achievement. And we have to inculcate, all of us have to inculcate young people as much as we can with the sense that they need to achieve our democracy, and we can't, and if not, we're going to surrender it. And that, to me, is the great danger. Policies can be reversed, but loss of faith in democratic institutions is hard to recover.
Thank you, David, very much for your time.